Around 6 o'clock on June the 5th, 1990, a cook in a local inn in Copenhagen was on her way to get ready for her shift at work. She headed down to the basement of a nearby building that the inn used both as a storeroom and a changing room for their staff members. But what she would find in there would take her day from being a day like any other to a day like nothing she had ever experienced before. That week, Copenhagen was in the midst of celebrating the Pentecost Carnival. The streets were full of life and excitement, with hundreds of people partying and having a good time throughout the city. But down in that particular basement, it was an entirely different story. There was only one cold grey light in the cellar as the cook shut and locked the door behind her, but that one light was all that she needed to make out the shape of a young woman lying on the basement floor. The woman's hands had been tied behind her back with a black cord that was also tied around her neck. She had 2 dishcloths stuffed into her mouth, and by that point, the dishcloths had caused the young woman to choke to death. After what was probably a much-needed moment to collect herself, the cook then called the police, who flocked to the scene. There, the investigators were able to do a closer inspection of the body, and they discovered that the young woman had several cuts on her neck, and that some sort of strange symbol or marking had been cut into her arm after she died. This symbol didn't actually mean anything, and it could have been a jumbled collection of letters or maybe even runes, and it did nothing to point the investigators in a particular direction that would lead them to knowing who this woman was and who had done this to her. A pack of condoms was then found stuffed under her body, and a thick substance that was later determined to be bone wax had been poured all over her remains. Bone wax is a wax which is sometimes mixed with things like petroleum jelly to make it softer and easier to apply. It's mainly used on bones during surgery. In this case, the bone wax had been mixed with a softening agent to allow the perpetrator to pour it all over the young woman's body, but the investigators on the scene had no clue why. They also still had no idea who this young woman was or what she was doing in that particular basement, but it didn't take long for her identity to come to light. Only a few floors up in the very same building, the girl who was missing from her home was named Stine Geisler. Anna usually went by her middle name, Stine, and she was an 18-year-old high school student who was only 3 days away from graduating. She was a popular girl who was known to be a happy, kind, and very thoughtful young woman. Her friends at school described her as bright and an intelligent student who was always ready to help anyone at the drop of a hat. Stine also had a very loving and open relationship with her parents and always told them when she was expecting to go or be somewhere. That was why her parents were so concerned when they woke up that morning and Stine wasn't in her room. A quick look outside also told them that her bicycle was still in the courtyard, and anyone who has been to Copenhagen before can tell you that a bicycle is the main way that anyone gets anywhere. Stine had been out to a friend's birthday party the night before, and she and her friends had later moved the party into the city centre so they could also take part in the Pentecost festival. She'd said goodbye to her friends around 2:30 a.m, and then she'd cycled home, and her friends weren't worried about her getting there safely. Stine hadn't had that much to drink that night, and she told her friends that she had to make sure that she didn't have a hangover the next day, as she had a family lunch to go to, and she had to study for an exam. That was one of the last things she said to her friends that night, and when Stine's parents were looking for her the next morning and spotted her bicycle out in the courtyard, it meant that she had to have made it home at some point. Her parents didn't waste any time, and they began calling other family members and friends to see if Stine was with them, or if they had any idea where Stine was, but no one had seen her since she'd left her friends in the city centre. Her parents quickly began running out of answers, and by the evening, when Stine still hadn't shown up and no one had called to say that she was with them, her parents reached out to the police. However, by that point, the police were already looking to contact her family too. Officers asked Stine's parents and her younger brother to come down to the local police station, where they told them that Stine's body had been found in the basement of her own home. After delivering this horrible news, investigators immediately jumped on the case, and thanks to the packet of condoms found underneath Stine's body, the first place they started looking for suspects was with Stine's male acquaintances. Stine also left the investigation team a list of people to start with, and that was because throughout her teenage years, she had meticulously kept a diary documenting her days and who she was spending time with. In her diary, Stine listed many male names, some of them turning out to be just friends, some of them quite a bit more, but one name in particular immediately stood out to investigators, and it was the one they had a hard time getting out of their minds. In her diary, Stine documented a romantic relationship she had struck up with a 40-year-old journalist who worked for one of the major newspapers in Copenhagen. Without wasting any time, investigators brought this journalist in for questioning, and he admitted to being in a relationship that Stine had described in her diary. He was forthcoming with investigators about the relationship he'd had with Stine, but what he couldn't provide the investigators with was a solid alibi for his whereabouts on the night that Stine was murdered. This only raised suspicions against him, but the investigators had no solid physical evidence to tie the journalist to the scene, and they had to let him go without charging him with anything. Despite the substantial age gap between them, Stine was legally an adult, and the journalist hadn't committed any crimes by being romantically involved with her. The police had nothing to charge him with, and they were forced to let him go, but the decision to let him go also came on top of many eyewitnesses coming forward to talk about Stine being with someone else. So many witnesses talked to the police after they found out that Stine had been murdered, and a lot of them stressed the fact that the man that Stine had spent her final day alive with had not actually been the journalist, but a different, younger man with stubble and short hair. Some witnesses had even seen Stine having lunch with this younger man during her break at her shift in a local cafe on the day of the 4th of June. Most witnesses said that they hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary while the two of them were together, but they did know for sure that he definitely was not the journalist. But there was one witness who noticed something quite unusual, and he would see it very early in the morning of the 5th. A watchman on the streets just outside the building that the Geislers lived in, and therefore the basement that Stine's body was later found in, reported seeing a young man with stubble and short hair standing in the doorway to the building around 2:55 a.m, just after Stine should have been arriving home. What was particularly interesting about this, aside from a man matching the description of one of Stine's male friends being at the scene of the crime, was that the watchman noted that this man was wearing leather trousers. This was particularly important because just a few days before she was murdered, witnesses reported seeing Stine talking to a man with short hair and wearing leather trousers outside her high school. Was Stine the victim of a stalking gone wrong, or was this man just closer to her than her diary was letting on? The investigators focused on finding the man with short hair and leather trousers, and then they quickly found out the identity of the man witnesses had seen Stine having lunch with the day before she was murdered. The investigators couldn't prove that he was the same man that was talking to Stine outside of her high school, but what was crucial to this case was that the man that she had spent her final lunch break with was able to produce a solid alibi for the night of her murder. The investigation was down another suspect, and it didn't take long for any other leads the investigators found to also run cold. But while the investigation was dying down, the media went wild, continuously publishing articles on Stine's case. Some newspapers even going as far as to manipulating and publishing pictures recreating the scene of the crime, and making this one of the most talked about cases in the country. And then later, with the growing popularity of the internet and the world. But no new clues were generated through all of this media coverage, not even after an audio recording of Stine's parents, where they begged for help from the residents of Copenhagen, was played on national television in the hopes that it would inspire someone to come forward with new information. The investigators conducted over 3,000 interviews in total, but none of them brought them closer to finding out who had done this, and why they had done the things they'd done to Stine after they'd murdered her. Stine's mother, Stine Geisler, who died in 2020, almost on the 30th anniversary of the death of her daughter, gave a statement to the Danish press, where she talked about the difficulties the family faced when deciding whether to move out of their apartment just above the basement where her daughter had been murdered. She said, "I wanted to leave. I just couldn't bear the thought, but my husband said that he could understand that, but that we would be sitting on a desert island if we moved." Somehow managing to put the feeling that all loved ones must feel when waiting for answers into words, and showing just how truly difficult it is.